Today we're going to be talking about Ascend to Zero. This is an action roguelike game made by South Korean studio Flyaway Games, who I wasn't aware of until this past week, where I somehow managed to get a key to not only this game, but also got access to a playtest for a different game that they're also working on, which we'll talk about a separate video soon in the future, but this was just like a strange coincidence that this happened in the same week. So before we get into the review, I do have to disclose that I received a key for this game for review purposes, and while I do not think my opinions on the game will be swayed by receiving the game for free, I do like to let the audience know so you all have full transparency and can make your own decisions on that. Also, the version of the game that I played was pre-release, so any small bugs or grievances that I have may be fixed in the launch version of the game. If I have to make any amendments, you'll be able to find them as a pinned comment in the comment section. So the gameplay of Ascend to Zero is kind of hard to explain. It's formatted like your typical action roguelike, where it is split into two parts, your dungeon runs and your hub meta progression area. But the mechanics of the game are strange. See, you will start off your run at level 1 in a dungeon where the first lot of enemies will also be level 1, but every sequential room in the game will have increasingly ascending levels of difficulty enemy, going from 1 to 25 to 50, etc., until the numbers become more and more ridiculous. The player can collect XP from the dead enemies to raise their own level, so they can raise their stats to be able to beat the exceedingly difficult enemies. The way the game is played is similar to your typical bullet heaven vampire survivor-like games, where you can equip weapons, level up your stats, add abilities and perks. Your weapons that you choose to equip will auto-attack for you, and you only really have direct control of your character, dashing, 2 gadget abilities, and your ultimate ability. And while this seems simple so far, the catch to the game is that you have 30 seconds of time to beat the game, which is kind of a lie, but to keep it simple for now, you have 30 seconds of real time, and when that runs out, it's game over. See, the game revolves around a time stop mechanic, which you have the ability to stop the countdown timer and freeze time, and this is tied to your ultimate ability. Now, when time is frozen, you are unable to attack enemies, but you're able to freely move about the dungeon, where you're able to prime gadget abilities, collect XP from dead enemies, equip items, weapons and gear and stuff like that. And you restart time by activating your ability, which is when your weapons and gadgets will begin to do damage again. The game controls are very simplistic. It is mostly just move around and do damage. Although if you have ranged weapons like guns or launchers, you can aim them if you want to. I was kind of worried when I started playing that this is all the game was going to be, but the bosses in the game surprisingly have mechanics that you need to play around, which keeps the combat more active and interesting, especially towards the latter half of the game, or at least until you progress to the point where you can just outscale them and then start one-shotting them. As with any good roguelike game, there is build crafting, and throughout your runs you can collect perks, weapon upgrades, stat upgrades and such, which you can use to upgrade yourself. The build crafting in this game is actually really good. A lot of the terminology is really clear, a lot of the upgrades have good synergy with each other, and the most important part, there are many different ways to create extremely powerful builds. You can create tank builds based around building up health and defense and reflecting damage hits. I once did a build around gaining damage via how much currency I was earning and then taking every upgrade that would just give me more money. One of the best ones that I managed to do, and the one that I was able to beat the game with, was early on in the game I found an upgrade where every percentage of movement speed I would get would also increase my attack speed. And then later on I found another upgrade that replaced my dash with a 70% movement speed increase. And then I found one that increased my attack damage via how much extra attack speed I had. And then I would just pick any upgrade from there on that increased my movement speed or attack speed, and then the game was just over. A lot of the upgrades in the game are percentage based, and it doesn't take long before the game starts dealing with absolutely ridiculous numbers. Like by the time I was finished with the game, doing billions of damage per hit was just the norm, and then trillions towards the end of my builds and towards the end of the game. And my main point is that there is very good build versatility, which I love. And some of that does come from the characters themselves. There are currently 6 different characters in the game. Well, they're called avatars because they're technically all the same person. It doesn't matter. Each avatar has a different ultimate ability, base stats that increase on using a certain weapon archetype, and all have their own unique perks found in runs that also focus around certain stats and their chosen weapon archetype. There are also gear sets that you can collect that will revolve around a certain avatar to help spice up builds even more. Alright, so moving on to the hub and the meta progression. The hub area is where you go to sort out all of your gear and upgrades and such, and over the course of the game you can equip up to 6 different weapons at once and up to 8 gear pieces. You can buy some of these from the shop, or you can pick them up throughout runs. Some of the ones you pick up for some reason need to be converted from being a temporary item to a permanent item before being able to take them into new runs, otherwise they'll get destroyed, which costs a certain currency to do, or sometimes you can take a percentage chance to do it for cheaper, but could result in the gear being destroyed. All gear comes in different tiers of rarity, with common being the lowest and mythic being the highest, and each piece of gear will also have a percentage of wear on them from 0 to 100%, which is how effective their base stats are going to be. Mythic tier items are usually part of the set, which will give extra stats, and sometimes character specific bonuses for collecting certain amounts of them or completing the set. Base stats and the quality of gear can also be re-rolled, so even if that you find an item that you're after, but it's of a bad quality, you're able to fix it up, but that doesn't come till much later in the game. A lot of the meta progression in the game is tied around gear and managing what best overall setup you can make. A lot of the gameplay systems feel a little dense, and a lot of the time it feels like you spend a bit too much time in menus. Oh, actually I forgot to mention one thing, upgrades. So, every piece of weapon and gear can be upgraded in the game, not only to make your temporary items permanent, but each separate piece of gear can also be upgraded via levels to up about 20 each. Your avatars not only have their own separate leveling system, which gives them access to new perks as you are able to level them up, but can also be separately upgraded so their base passive stats and damage are better. There is also a different menu where you can upgrade your base overall stats that carry between all of the avatars. Also, every gadget ability in the game can also be upgraded. You can also upgrade the time machine so it'll let you take more of a certain percentage of a stat going into a run. You can upgrade the runs themselves so enemies will have chances to drop better upgrades or have a chance to drop more perks or drop more weapons and just upgrade a lot of the things that can pop up in the runs. And this is what you're going to spend a lot of time doing in the game, which is why in Ascend to Zero it feels like you're spending more time crafting how the number go up rather than experiencing the number go up. It's not necessarily a bad thing if you like games where you have fun build crafting and min-maxing your character to the absolute maximum. Look, this game has that. There are multiple different broken builds you can create, and there is a good dopamine rush on the quick rushes of gameplay that make the number go up. The thing I like the most about Ascent to Zero is I like the attention to detail of the build crafting. Like having clear and easy to see stats as you play, and things like having your weapon DPS be on the screen so you're able to check how well the build is working out, and what weapons seem to do the most damage and how consistent it is. Not only that, but having weapons have clear tags on them so you know what perks will actually affect the stats on them. Can't remember the tags on your weapons, the game will highlight the weapons on the side if it will be affected by an upgrade. And even though the game seems like it is pretty dense, and it is, I've personally found it very easy to get around. But I also found myself taking a lot of time going through gear and matching sets and upgrading and dissolving weapons for money and managing inventories and stuff like that. Which is why I think maybe like 80 to 90% of the game is probably actually just doing this rather than playing the game, or it felt like it was for me. But the strange thing is that it kind of works. The build management followed by the quick bursts of gameplay just kind of activates the dopamine receptors in my brain in a weird way, and I got pretty addicted to it. It feels like all of this shouldn't work, and it feels like the balance is off by a lot, but it does work. And the design of the overall game kind of reminds me a little bit of a mobile game, but instead of hiding progression behind predatory microtransactions, it's actually just a game, like a normal game. So yeah, overall I do like the gameplay of Ascent to Zero. It's very unusual. The gameplay to spreadsheet management ratio is definitely off by a huge margin, but I found it addicting nonetheless. Moving on to the story, the game takes place in a post-apocalypse where the world is being overrun with monsters. Humanity creates an android in hopes of saving humanity and casts them off into a time machine. And this is kind of where we start the game. From there, it's our job to go through a time loop to save our friends and find a way to stop the apocalypse. So I found the story in this game to be serviceable, but it's probably one of the weakest links of the overall experience. Like, it works as a vehicle to drive the gameplay a little bit, but I didn't really find it interesting at all, and the characters are all pretty cliche, and the one major story beat the game has to play was something that I could see just coming a mile away. It also seemed like there were a few mistranslations throughout the story and some weird verbiage around the place as well. Also found a couple of menu prompts that were just in another language, and these are the kind of things that I would chalk up to the game being made in South Korea, with English not being the primary language that the game was made for. There is also the issue of what happens if you progress through the story of the game a bit too quickly. I found that because I had one good run where I was able to blitz through a heavy chunk of the game in one go, it kind of broke the story a bit. Characters would have conversations with me about monsters I defeated like 3 runs ago, or talking about progress I made in the story like 10 runs ago. just kind of further distanced me from engaging with the overall narrative. Moving on to the art style, which will be pretty brief as there really isn't that much to talk about here. The game looks fine. Look, the overall art, it's not a standout. I do think that the monster designs are pretty neat. The effects of weapons and attacks are also kind of decent, but there are a few times towards the late game where everything can get a bit overwhelming, but there is the ability to turn down a lot of the effects to help with visual clarity, which is especially needed when you need to track some of the attacks of the later bosses, which can get pretty intense. Moving on to music, the soundtrack of this is comprised entirely of EDM, which I think fits the game very well. I enjoyed the soundtrack quite a bit. When it runs, the game will swap between a more mellow music for when time is stopped and action beat pumping music for when it's in real time. And while I like the music, the problem is evidently that I don't get to hear much of the action music because I spent more time in the time stop than I did in real time. I'm hoping the soundtrack will be available on streaming. I'm not sure if it will, but it is going to be listenable via a separate DLC with the game, which I don't know, we'll have to see how much that is. And while we're on the topic of audio, I just really wanted to quickly talk about sound design. It's not one of those things I mention unless it's really good or really bad. And unfortunately in this case, there are just more than a few instances of the sound in this game being just completely unbalanced. Just sound effects that seem to be 3 times louder than anything else in the game and don't seem to be affected much by the volume mixer. Things like attacking the training dummy in the hub can trigger it, and there are a few bosses around the place that have major moves that can just blow out the eardrums, and I think this does need to be looked at ASAP. Also, the main character in the game just talks way too much. I think she's just set to say a line like every 30 seconds or so, because she will just say random lines here and there that have no correlation as to what's going on. Half the time you'll be in a menu and you just say something. Luckily, there is a volume slider for voices that works, so I turned her way down very early on in the game because it was driving me nuts. Moving on to performance, when I launched this game, the default settings were set to a 60 FPS cap on medium graphics, and I think I played the game for about 4 hours before realizing that I hadn't even bothered to look at the graphics menu. And the game was able to maintain that performance with my specs pretty easily, which are on the screen now, though there were a couple frame slowdowns when the game got extremely hectic, but they were brief and didn't really affect the gameplay at all. When I figured out that I could change the graphics, I set it to the highest graphics settings with an uncapped frame rate, and I found the game to run at a high but pretty inconsistent frame rate. It would fluctuate anywhere between 120 to 80 FPS depending on what was going on. But there was one boss later on in the game which dropped the FPS down to about 40 just because of all the crap that was going on. Again, it didn't affect gameplay too much, but it is a noticeable slowdown. I also tested this game on the Steam Deck. This game currently isn't rated for the Steam Deck, but I thought I'd give it a try anyway, and the game actually ran decently. And it's pretty much the same way it runs on my main rig. There were a few cases of the game dropping frames when the game got hectic. The thing is, due to the simplistic control scheme of the game, this game actually plays very decently on the Steam Deck. Though inventory management can be a little bit more difficult, but I enjoyed playing this game on the deck and found myself playing through a few runs while in bed after I'd done my initial testing. And it'll probably stay installed on the deck because it's a very good play for 30 minutes and then drop before going to bed kind of deal. So in conclusion, Ascent to Zero is a weirdly designed game. The gameplay to spreadsheet simulator ratio is a bit off, but I enjoyed it nonetheless. The game is rough around the edges in a technical sense with some really bad cases of audio mixing that need to be fixed ASAP. The story is okay, but if you find yourself moving through the game too quickly, it can break the story a bit. And I do think that the later on you get in the game, it does get a little bit grindy. Speaking of which, the game took me about 15 hours to beat. It probably could have been a bit quicker if I clued into some of the more broken builds a bit earlier than I had, so I'd put the average time to beat somewhere between 15 to 10 hours. But when you beat the game, it unlocks something called multi-dimension mode, which is the ability to redo the dungeon in the game at a higher difficulty. And you can keep going through that and everything will scale higher and higher each time you beat it. I don't know how long it goes on for. There is a Steam achievement for getting past multi-dimension level 12, so there's at least 12 levels to it, but I don't know how far it goes. Ascend to Zero is out now and available on the Xbox Series S/X and also PC via Steam or Xbox Game Pass. It will be available for $12 USD or $17 Australian, which for the price is pretty good, I think, despite the amount of jank. It's also 20% off on Steam for the next 2 weeks as of time of upload. And I couldn't find any word yet on if or when it will be available on other platforms. Look, Ascend to Zero is a strange game, as I've said many times throughout this review, but I think the extensive build system and the satisfaction of building power in the game is the thing that people will like the most about it. And that is all I have to say, so thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, then please leave the video a like, and if you're new to the channel, then please consider subscribing. As always, many thanks to my YouTube members for their continued support of the channel. It's always appreciated. Alright, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.